Thank you so much. Have you got the slides on? Yesterday, James Hartley called me and said that it wasn't really going to work for him to speak tonight, so he asked me to stand in for him, which is kind of an interesting opportunity. I will have spoken 3 Friday nights in a row because for next year I'm on the list for the first Friday night. So I decided to give you a 2-part series on Sunday laws. I'm not sure I hit this and put it on, but it's gone back blank again. So you may have to turn it on again. I'll get it up on there pretty soon. It's interesting, whenever there's something important, you have difficulties. And I usually send my slides to them, but I tried over and over again and was not able to do it. And finally we put it on a stick, and so they have it that way. But we can expect difficulties when we talk about something that's very current in regard to what I believe is possible very soon. Now, whenever we talk about these things, of course, we have to realize that man has an agenda and a timetable that they want to accomplish that agenda. But God has no problem throwing a monkey wrench in it and giving us more time. But at some point, he may not do that. And I'm beginning to wonder if we aren't at that point. Of course, the patriarchs, they were fairly free, and they didn't have a lot of trouble as far as we know. But as soon as the descendants of Abraham got into Egypt, they began to have a problem with keeping the Sabbath. And at first, I suppose quite a few of them kept the Sabbath, but as time went on, it got fewer and fewer, to where the majority of the Israelites were not keeping the Sabbath. And some of them that had kept the Sabbath were martyred for their determination to keep the Sabbath. And so now we come down to the point where Moses has been sent back to fulfill the mission of bringing them out of Egypt. And here is part of what happened, recorded in Exodus 5, verses 4 and 5. And the king of Egypt said unto them, Wherefore do ye, Moses and Aaron, now we don't use that word in that way anymore, but it means hinder. In other words, Moses and Aaron, stop hindering the people from their works. Well, they wouldn't hinder 6 days of the week, but there was one day of the week where Moses and Aaron were telling them not to work. And I can imagine what Moses said was, if you expect God to deliver you out of Egypt, you've got to start keeping the Sabbath. Here you are breaking the Sabbath. You need to start keeping it. So they listened to him. Don't know how many, but maybe quite a few. And Pharaoh was not happy about it. He said, Get you unto your burdens. And Pharaoh said, Behold, the people of the land now are many, and ye make them rest. Now that word rest is the exact same word that's in Genesis, the 3rd chapter, or 2nd chapter, talking about the Sabbath. Ye make them rest from their burdens. Or in other words, you're making them keep the Sabbath. And so Pharaoh was determined to get this stopped. And here was his plan. And Pharaoh commanded the same day the taskmasters of the people and their officers, saying, Ye shall no more give the people straw to make brick, as heretofore. Let them go and gather straw for themselves. And the tale of the bricks which they did make heretofore, ye shall lay upon them. Ye shall not diminish aught thereof, for they be idle. In other words, they're resting because they don't have enough work to do. So now they have to gather the straw and make the same number of bricks that had been made before. Therefore they cry, saying, Let us go and sacrifice to our God. Let there more work be laid upon the men, that they may labor therein, and let them not regard vain words. So the counsel of Moses was considered by Pharaoh vain words. The Sabbath didn't matter to him, but it's supposed to matter to God's people. Now, perhaps if they had been faithful all along in Sabbath keeping, they would not have had such a problem at this point. But they had not been faithful, and so they were now, it's like an Adventist that joins the army, and then they just, after they're in the army, they decide, I would like to keep the Sabbath. That's a lot harder than when you tell them in the beginning that you can't keep the Sabbath. That you are going to keep the Sabbath. And so you can understand Pharaoh's anger at this, but what God wants us to learn from this is that this is pointing to the end times. It's going to be difficult to keep the Sabbath. Now, in my lifetime, and I think my parents' lifetime, we have had it easy to keep the Sabbath. So, we don't really know whether we're Sabbath keepers or not. We really don't know. We think we are, but we don't know. Until we are tested by it being difficult, we will find out whether we are Sabbath keepers or not. And I'm not sure, I think it was probably mixed with them. But then we go on down to the time of Esther, which was in the Medo-Persian Empire, and we see another forecast of trouble in the future. Verses 8 and 9 of Esther chapter 3, And Haman said unto King Ahasuerus, There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of thy kingdom, and their laws are diverse from all people. Notice what Haman was concerned about. It was about the different laws that the Jews had. Neither keep they the king's laws. Of course, he had just gotten past a law that you could only worship the king. And he sort of got in there too. Therefore, it is not for the king's profit to suffer them. If it please the king, let it be written that they may be destroyed. And so, as we look at what happened to the Jews who were Sabbath keepers, to whatever degree, I don't fully know, but they had two laws that were different, and that was they didn't believe in worshiping a human being, and they didn't believe that you should work on the seventh day. And so he may have been referring to one or both of those. However, we have a wonderful end to this one, because in chapter 8, verses 7 and 8, and verse 17, it says, Then the king Ahasuerus said unto Esther the queen, and to Mordecai the Jew, Write ye also for the Jews, as it liketh you, in the king's name, and seal it with the king's ring. And in every province and in every city, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a good day. and many of the people of the land became Jews, for the fear of the Jews fell upon them. Now here, stories in the Old Testament are frequently prophecies of the future. That was their prophetic ability, and I don't know how much they knew about the future based on the stories, but they could have understood. However, just like a parable, not every detail will work out exactly the same as it did in the story. But as we look here at the story in Esther, we see that Satan was moving to wipe out the Jews. And his method of setting them up for that is having laws passed that were different from the laws that they believed they should follow. And so they got in trouble. And they got to the point where actually a law had been passed that all of them were to be killed unless they would give up following their distinctive laws. And we see this as a forecast of what is going to happen in the future. And that point is going to be exact. There will be a law finally passed to destroy every Sabbath keeper on planet Earth. It will take time for it to build up to that point, but it's going to get to that point. And the same deliverance that is spoken about here in the book of Esther is going to take place. But this time, it's going to happen by the voice of God. He's going to speak out of heaven, and he's going to say, "It is done." And when he says, "It is done," the Euphrates River dries up because the Pope and all those that are following him, their whole cause is wiped out in just a moment when God says, "It is done." So this story should have very special meaning for us. And if you're like me, I don't do sports anymore, but when I did, I didn't like to lose. And so I did everything possible to win. I don't like to lose. So we're going to be, if we're still Sabbath keepers at that point, we're going to be on the winning side. And those that have attacked us and so on are going to lose. Then we go to Daniel, and we see another story that predicts what's going to happen. In Daniel 3, verses 4 to 6. Then an herald cried aloud, "To you it is commanded, O people, nations, and languages, that at what time ye hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music, ye fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. And whoso falleth not down and worshipeth shall the same hour be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace." Notice how this keeps repeating, this problem with worship. And in the time of Daniel, we see that it comes up again. And something very interesting in this story, we don't have time, we trust that you know the basic story. In this one, it was an image that they were supposed to bow down to. And that, of course, ties in Revelation, which we'll come to in a little bit. And so, obviously, this story is talking about a day in the future when people are going to bow down and worship the image to the beast. And it's a warning, don't do it. Daniel's 3 friends, Daniel was somewhere else at this time. And so his 3 friends were in that crowd, and they had to make a decision. Are we going to worship this image or not? And they chose not to do it. And as a result, they did get thrown in, but God delivered them. Now, he's not going to deliver everyone in the last days, but if he chooses to deliver them, he will. And we know the 144,000 will be delivered. They will probably go through all kinds of things, and yet they can't get them. God delivers them from it. And so whether we're delivered or not, we still gain the victory. Then we go down to Jesus, who also was concerned about this. Matthew 24, verses 15 through 21. When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place. And here the Bible puts in a thought, whoso readeth, let him understand. So the question is, do we understand? We are supposed to understand this prophecy. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house, neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes, immediately to leave. And woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. Now let me just mention here, those of you that think about having children, you better pray hard, because this is a warning. And if you miss the warning and you go ahead when God didn't call you to do that, it says, woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. But pray ye that your flight be not in the winter. You can imagine what it would be like to start out for the mountains in the winter time. Neither on the Sabbath day. How can you keep Sabbath very well if you have to be running? But pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day, for then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. Now, I believe there's a clue here that indicates a double application. I couldn't put all the text in this sermon tonight, but hopefully you're familiar with some of them. In the book of Daniel, it says, there will be a time of trouble such as there has never been upon the earth. And we know that to be the time after the close of probation. And so here again, there is reference to a time of trouble that never existed before. Now, the 1,260 years qualified up to that time. It was the worst time of trouble. It was the longest, and it was the worst. But there's another one coming that's even worse. And so there, in this particular chapter, we have a prophecy that has more than one fulfillment. Now here, I think some people are getting confused. The primary fulfillment of any prophecy that has more than one application, the final one is the primary one, not the first one. It's the last one that is the primary one. And so let's look at a few things to help us see the truthfulness of this two application idea. Desire of Ages, page 628, says Jesus did not answer his disciples by taking up separately the destruction of Jerusalem and the great day of his coming. He mingled the description of these two events. There's a key word. When he answered the disciples, he was talking about two events, and he mingled, it says, the description of these two events. In mercy to them, he blended the description of the two great crises. So there's another key word. he blended the two together. Now, if you've ever blended anything, you can't tell the difference, what you put in there. Those things became one, blended. So that's a very interesting word. When he referred to the destruction of Jerusalem, his prophetic words reached beyond that event to the final conflagration. So there's 3 times clear statements that this prophecy has a double application. And in Signs of the Times of February 20, 1901, says the description of the 2 events is mingled. So there's that word again. And the entire subject is a warning to those who shall live in the last scenes of Earth's history. So there's the primary application of it. In the last days of Earth's history, the last scenes of Earth's history. 2 applications. And that's not the only prophecy that has more than one application. In the book Maranatha, page 180, says the time is not far distant when, like the early disciples, we shall be forced to seek a refuge in desolate and solitary places. As the siege of Jerusalem by the Roman armies was the signal for flight to the Judean Christians, so the assumption of power on the part of our nation, and it's talking about the United States, but notice what we are to focus our eyes on. In the decree enforcing the papal Sabbath will be a warning to us. Now, if you're familiar with the history, the Roman armies came, they surrounded Jerusalem, and then trouble elsewhere caused the army to leave. And if Jesus hadn't warned them, they would have had the idea the problem is gone. It's over. We don't have to worry about it. But he said, don't hesitate. Don't even go into your house. You cross the roofs of all the houses. You get outside the wall of Jerusalem. You don't go, if you're in the field, you just leave. You don't go back and pick up anything. You take off. And here it equates what people need to do when the Sunday law is passed. Now, God has been telling us to leave the cities for a long time. This is what I call the last call to leave the city, and you probably lose your property. You can't sell it at that point. You're just going to have to forget it and just walk out. Now you can sell your property in the city and buy a country home, but at that point, it's too late. When that Sunday law is passed, you leave, and you don't bother to take much with you. It will then be time to leave the large cities, preparatory to leaving the smaller ones for retired homes in secluded places among the mountains. So there's 2 steps after that. We leave all the big cities. If there's anybody left in there, I'm glad to be out ahead of time. Although sometimes I wonder if we're far enough out here. But we go to the smaller towns, and then we have to leave that as well. You'll see the reference at the end of this. By the decree enforcing the institution of the papacy, in violation of the law of God, our nation will disconnect herself fully from righteousness. So this nation started out, it had the best laws, it had the best viewpoint on religious liberty that any nation had ever had. But when the Sunday law is passed, this nation will disconnect herself fully from righteousness. And then again, it gives us the signal. As the approach of the Roman armies was a sign to the disciples of the impending destruction of Jerusalem, so may this apostasy be a sign to us. And then it lists 4 things. It's a sign to us as Seventh-day Adventists. So are we paying attention to what is going on? If we're not, how will we recognize the sign? Right after that, it says, it's a sign that the limit of God's forbearance is reached. You know, nations have a period of probation. And when that national Sunday law is reached, this nation will have finished its probation. That the limit of God's forbearance is reached. That the measure of our nation's iniquity is full, and that the angel of mercy is about to take her flight, never to return. And the 4th one, the people of God will then be plunged into those scenes of affliction and distress which prophets have described as the time of Jacob's trouble. Now, it's not listing all of the events there, but this is sequential, that the 3 are talking about what's happening to the United States when that decision is made. And the last one is telling us an event that happens after the close of the probation for the whole world. There is a little time between when the United States closes its probation and when the world closes its probation, but those events are in order. So we need to see the Sunday law as a sign, and it won't be long till all these things have taken place. Question is, are we ready? If it were to come, let's say this next year, are we ready for these events? Now, the Bible also tells some other things. In John 16, verse 2, it says, they shall put you out of the synagogues. In other words, we call it disfellowship. You will get disfellowship, perhaps. Now, not everybody, I'm sure, because the local church has power, and so not every church will disfellowship people, but apparently some will. Matthew 10:17, but beware of men, for they will deliver you up to the councils. You know, people, when they don't like you and they don't want to face you, they just speak to somebody that can do something to you. And you don't even know who spoke to them. But all of a sudden you find yourself standing before the council. And they will scourge you in their synagogues. Now, I don't know whether that will be literal in our day. It was literal back then. But, you know, words can be a pretty rough scourge to people. So we know at least it'll be embarrassment, it'll be ridicule, it will be all kinds of things that will be said to us by our brethren. And in Luke 21, verse 12, but before all these, talking about earthquakes and, you know, these different things, they shall lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and into prisons, being brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake. Do you have the Christian experience tonight to face that soon? If not, it's time for us to be preparing, to be getting ready. Matthew 23:34. Here he warns his disciples what will happen. Wherefore, behold, I send you prophets and wise men and scribes. No, this is telling the Jews what they are going to do. Wherefore, behold, I send unto you prophets and wise men and scribes, and some of them ye shall kill and crucify, and some of them shall ye scourge in your synagogues, and persecute them from city to city. From a manuscript 105 in 1894, we read this: in these last days, the history of the Jewish nation is being repeated in the Christian church. So this applies again. It's not just what happened back then. Yes, it happened back then, but it's going to happen again. Now we go on to Revelation 13. This is probably the best known text we'll look at tonight. However, I hear some interesting misunderstandings about this passage. And the he represents the United States. And he exerciseth all the power of the first beast. And the first beast in Revelation is the papacy. So the United States is going to act just like the Catholic Church. And when you read about what the Catholic Church has done in the past, you get an idea of how the United States is going to act. Of the first beast before him, and causeth the earth and them which dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. Now the word earth, all the way through here, is talking about the United States. So the United States is going to require its residents, it's going to require them to worship the papacy. And he had power to give life unto the image of the beast. Who is the he again? It's the United States. The United States has power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. And he causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads, and that no man might buy or sell save he that had the mark. Here is a perfect clue of the United States. We are not a warlike nation. Recently, I read a book about the Second World War, about a family that was Polish, and what happened to them when the Germans took them over, and then after that, the Russians took them over, and the kind of things that they experienced were just unreal. And yet God brought them through that experience. This is not to say that some of the U.S. soldiers can't do some of the same terrible things, but in general, we like to use financial stress to control people. Boycott is our favorite tool. And so we see here evidence all the way through this that is talking about the United States. In The Day Dawn, page 27, it says, this prophecy, talking about Revelation 13 here, this prophecy will be fulfilled when the United States shall enforce Sunday observance, which Rome claims as the special acknowledgement of her supremacy. So that's when this prophecy will be fulfilled. The question is, how long before it's going to be fulfilled? In Revelation 13, verse, that's quoted here, but this comes from Counsels to the Church, page 39. In the issue of the conflict, all Christendom will be divided into two great classes. So now we're looking at the whole world. Any place where Christians exist, the whole Christian world will be divided into two classes: those who keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus, and those who worship the beast and his image and receive his mark. Although church and state will unite their power to compel all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive the mark of the beast, yet the people of God will not receive it. So there's the good news. Those that are prepared for what we are to go through will remain true, and they will not receive the mark of the beast. The question is whether we will be among them or not. But there's no reason why we can't be among them, because God is standing ready to prepare us and to help us so that whenever it comes, we may not be ready ahead of time, but there is work to be done right now so that when the time comes, he will have us fully ready. In Counsels on Stewardship, page 51, it says, "With such a curse hanging over the transgressors of God's holy Sabbath, should we not show greater earnestness, greater zeal? Are we going to just let it happen to them? And they don't even know why it's happening to them?" So since we know about the Sunday laws, it's not just for us to get ready, but for us to do everything we can to help them so that they don't have to suffer this. Why are we so indifferent? I suppose that word best describes the Adventist church in general today. Not everybody, of course, but in general, Seventh-day Adventists are indifferent. But it asks the question, why are we so indifferent? So selfish? So engrossed in temporal interest? You know, people are, unfortunately, church members are described in these three thoughts: indifferent, selfish, and so wrapped up in making a living in this world and getting what we need to have. And you know, it's not just outside self-supporting work. We can be just as wrapped up in making a living in this work as they are. And there's no time to prepare, no ability, no space for us to get ready or to properly help those around us. And so these are very thought-provoking questions. With such a curse hanging over the transgressors of God's holy Sabbath, should we not show greater earnestness, greater zeal? Why are we so indifferent, so selfish, so engrossed in temporal interests? Is our interest separated from Jesus? We need to answer those questions between us and God. In closing, I want to share 4 important mile markers. Now, I'm sure there's a lot more, but I want to share 4 that I feel really help us to know where we are at right now. I don't remember the exact time I first heard this, but I think it was somewhere around 2012, somewhere in there, that Protestants publicly stated, the protest is over. Here we are, 6 years since that was stated, and it was on YouTube. Anybody could see it. The protest is over. In other words, we can unite with the Catholic Church from now on. We can do that. That was a real wake-up call for Seventh-day Adventists. But did it really wake us up? I don't think so. Number 2, the Pope was allowed to speak to Congress for the first time in history. Never before. He came to this country and he would speak in big cities and draw huge crowds, but never was he allowed to speak to Congress. That is a wake-up call for Seventh-day Adventists. And that happened 3 years ago. And number 3, the first law is already moving forward as a family day when no employer is allowed to have their employees work. That's so that everybody can stay home. And of course, they're not saying go to church, but that's, of course, what they have in mind. Now, we're going to study more next Friday night about Sunday laws, but the details of exactly how it's going to happen have not been revealed. But this is something that should wake us up. The fact that it is already being proposed, and my understanding is that there have been a number of people in the U.S. that have been calling their congressmen and urging that this go forward because they think it's a good idea. And it's all under the climate change idea. But you know, there's one that to me is bigger than all 3 of these. The North American Division reply to the annual council in 2018. Now, some of you may not be aware of the conflict that has taken place over women's ordination, but repeatedly there has been a segment of the Adventist Church that has tried to get the world church to vote in favor of it. In 2015 at the GC, it was presented again in this way: please allow every division to make their own decision. Don't make us all and the whole world follow the same rule, but allow the individual divisions to make their own decision. And the world church said, no, we want to stick together on this issue. Well, it didn't stop the ordaining of women in this country. They kept on going, even have a conference president, that you're not supposed to be a conference president without being ordained. And so it just kept on going. So the annual council spoke several times about this, but in 2018, they decided if entities in the Adventist Church do not obey the decision of the world church, they will be disciplined. And they outlined what the discipline would be, which was pretty mild discipline, but it was discipline. Right after the annual council, there was the North American Division year-end meetings. And here's what they decided. We are compelled to reject the spirit and direction of this document voted at the 2018 Annual Council, as it is not consistent with the biblical model of the church. In other words, they're saying the world church is no longer manifesting Christian behavior. The world church has gone off. We simply cannot, in good conscience, support or participate in the implementation of the process outlined in the document, which is the disciplinary process. Now, of course, it wasn't voted at a GC, it was voted by an annual council, but there are representatives there from the world field, and so they're saying They were not Christian in the way they wanted to deal with us, and so we are not going to comply. Now that's bad enough, but they also made this recommendation: to recommend the NAD administration to discuss with the General Conference the issue of financial parity, with parity to be accomplished in 2 to 3 years. Now, what does that mean? It means that because the Seventh-day Adventist Church started in America, and because of the prosperity of America, this division has put more money into the world field than any other. And 6% of their tithe goes to the GC to help the world field. But the rest of the divisions only give 2%. And so way back in the Utrecht meeting, some who debated the issue of women's ordination said to the world field, if you don't give us ordination, we're going to cut the money. Well, now they're following through with it, or at least attempting to. I don't know how much they can do, whether they can do it against the GC's agreement, but anyway, they want to drop it from 6% to 2% so that they give only the same amount that all the other divisions give. Now that's going to damage the world field at a time when we should be expanding as fast as we can expand throughout the whole world. And even the places that have had less light than this country should be getting more money, not less money. And yet this is the decision that was reached. Now here's the thought that came to my mind, and I have no proof of it. But my mind went to the time when the disciples were convinced that Jesus deserved to be the king, that he could provide food, he could heal the soldiers, he deserved to be king, but he was so humble he wouldn't do it. And so they decided to take him by force and make him king. They were convinced he deserved it. Jesus said, no, you get in the boat and you cross the lake. While they were crossing that lake, they started thinking, maybe Jesus is an imposter. From wanting to crown him king to thinking he was an imposter. And what did Jesus do? He sent a storm. And the storm got their mind off from him being an imposter. And the thought came to mind, maybe God is going to let this Sunday law go through to get the world church's mind off of this topic, to give them something else to think about. I mean, this is going to shake this church from stem to stern. When those Sunday laws start, it's going to shake everything. Now, as I say, I can't prove that, but those are the thoughts that came to mind. How soon? I don't know. But we'll study a little more about what we do know next Friday night. Let's have a closing hymn. Our song leaders can come up. The song about the waymarks. What's the number? Look for the waymarks. As the song says, the journey is almost o'er. Shall we kneel for prayer? Our Father in heaven, as we see these events and many others, it seems that the end is screaming to us. And yet, even we are in danger of being indifferent, of being selfish, of lacking an interest for those that need to know what's going on. And so we pray tonight that you will help us to really be cured, since we don't know exactly when these things will play out, how much hindrance you will still give to their plans, but we know if their plans succeed, it won't be very long before these Sunday laws begin. And so we're praying for your special blessing upon each one here tonight. May even this Sabbath play a part in helping us to get ready for the scenes that are ahead of us. Help us to wake up, to be cured of these terrible diseases, and to be ready as these things take place to recognize those waymarks. And we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.